Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Kalika and you're gonna be a spicier person after watching this video. Have fun getting fired from your own family business. This is a story that's been in the making for almost 3 years, but it finally concluded with a jerk employee getting what he deserved. This concluded a few days ago, but I've been too tired to sit down and write about it until now. Heck, even now I'm tired, so please excuse any grammar errors. Why am I so tired? You'll find out at the end of the story. Also, I'm sorry if things don't make a lot of sense or the technical stuff is hard to follow. I tried to make it easy to read, but trying to simplify what I do for a living and how the tech at work functions is really hard to do. If you want any clarifications on something, let me know and I'll reply to you in the comments. I mentioned in other posts that I work as a PPAP specialist at a local manufacturing company. We make mainly automotive parts, but we also have a few military jobs that we are super hush-hush about. If you don't know what PPAPing is or what my job involves, it's basically a process manufacturers go through to certify parts and their manufacturing processes and give customers a guarantee their parts are being made per their specs and are performing well in all tests. PPAP, Production Part Approval Process, is an annual thing for 98% of the hundreds of different parts we make. My main job as a PPAP specialist is to gather dimensions and measurements with a Faro arm. It's essentially a mobile CMM with a laser 3D scanner. We only have one arm and I'm now the only person who is certified in using it. It wasn't always the case. I was hired into this company almost 3 years ago by my boss. My boss, I'll call him Steve, and I actually worked together before my last job. I quit that company and he left soon after I did after it began to collapse, partially due to me quitting, but that's another story. My boss and I always had a very good relationship, so he called me up and asked me if I wanted to work for him at my current company. I was hired pretty much on the spot, and that did not sit well with the jerky employee. I'll call him Joe. Joe was the other user of the company's arm, but he wasn't very good at it and was slow in turning out reports for the parts he inspected. Steve got tired of his slow progress because he knew the process didn't take that long and wanted to hire an additional firearm specialist, one who knew what she was doing. Joe is the son of the owner of this company. This company is family owned and started in the late 80s by the current owner's dad, Joe's grandfather, and has exploded to the point where the company has several locations around the country. The place I work at is their headquarters. Being the son of the owner and, in his eyes, the next owner of the company, Joe was arrogant, entitled, and got away with pretty much everything. His dad hired him as soon as he graduated high school and he did various jobs around the company, his title changing frequently. He was lazy and often stole time from the company by playing games on his phone, taking long breaks, chatting with other employees and just wandering around the building. His dad, I'll call him Bob, let him get away with it and often made excuses for him. Steve was tired of his crap, and part of the reason he hired me was to show Joe how to do his job and how a better employee could easily replace him. Joe immediately saw me as a threat to his position. On day 1, Steve placed me in front of the firearm and let me show off what I knew to both Joe and Bob. Joe wanted to put me through the most difficult test he could imagine. He placed a part and the print in front of me and asked me to identify the datums, scan the part, and perform a datum alignment of the scan to the CAD model. This is a fairly standard way to inspect the parts on a firearm. I didn't think much of it. I was actually thinking this was just a test to prove my worth, so I began to work right away. The part was fairly complex, so it took me about 15 minutes to scan and probe. But after I was done, I did the alignment, ran the program Joe made, and the inspection was completed all within 20 minutes. Steve wasn't that surprised. He knew how efficiently I worked. Bob was impressed, and Joe was just angry. I had no idea why at the time. I'm used to dealing with grumpy coworkers, so I figured Joe was just going to be one of those people. Because of his seniority in the company, Joe sort of became my boss, or at least the person I reported to. Steve was his boss, and was really mine as well. I eventually started working afternoon shift at the company for a while, so the days went like this. Joe would inspect parts in the morning and I would come in and continue where he left off. With so many parts, we were always busy inspecting them or their gauge and fixtures, but then I noticed that I was getting more and more bogged down with the parts than usual. PPAP due dates were fast approaching and we were slowly getting behind. I asked Joe what was taking him so long to scan parts and he would always come up with excuses like, the alignments weren't working, or your programs were not measuring the right features, or the print asks for a lot of features to be checked and that takes time. All of those excuses were just bad. At this point in time, I've been using Faro arms and similar devices for almost 10 years, 7 of them professionally. Yes, sometimes alignments can be weird, especially if the part being scanned is badly out of form, or the CAD model is not the correct version. I'm not saying I never make mistakes, but blaming a massive delay on a program issue does not make any sense. Plus, Joe is fully capable of fixing any errors in the programs. And yes, many of our prints call for between 50 to over 100 different features that the program must be made to inspect, but when done right, the program does everything on its own and you just have to sit back and watch it fix the occasionally badly extracted measurement that pops up. I kind of ignore this, but I do take a little mental note of it. PPAPs continued to be slow, and eventually Steve asked Joe what was going on. Joe gave him the same lame excuses and even threw me under the bus by saying I was the one taking forever to inspect parts. Steve worked with me before and never had a problem with me, so he knew something wasn't adding up. He was also quite familiar with Joe's slow performance. No one ever questioned Joe why firewall inspections took so long because no one knew how it worked and just assumed it took a long time. When I showed up, it was becoming increasingly obvious that the arm wasn't the problem, Joe was. Steve came to me and talked to me about the PPAP progress, and I told him everything. Steve agreed and told me that Joe has always been slow, and that was one of the reasons he brought me into the company. I then started to get the feeling that Joe was out to get me. Steve talked to Joe, and this seemed to light a fire under his butt as projects started to get done much faster. So fast, in fact, Joe was getting entire scanning jobs done before I even came in, so I would then get started on the next job on the list. Things seemed to be okay at that point, and I became more comfortable with working with Joe. This continued until pretty recently. My company was exploding again with the addition of a brand new mega customer that gave us almost a dozen new jobs and half of them were blow molded. The company was already having trouble fitting into our current building, so they ended up building a brand new giant one about 20 minutes away. We were still in the process of moving there, and every time a job starts up at the new building, they have to be re-PPAP'd as if they were a new part. So now we're twice as busy, with more and more jobs being dropped on Joe's desk and mine every day. We worked as normal until I noticed something weird. I was going to scan and inspect the job I did only 6 months ago, but the program I made was barely functional. It was missing features, numbers that were supposed to correspond to the print didn't match up at all, and my alignments didn't work all that well. I initially blamed this on a computer error since we had the hard drive fail in our old computer that ran the inspection software, and some of the files weren't recovered or were damaged. I rebuilt the program, ran it, and inspected my parts. Building an inspection program that checks 78 features takes time, and I had to rebuild almost half of this one. This set me behind, and I talked to Steve about it. He was understanding, but urged me and Joe to pick up the pace. The next day, the same thing happened to another one of my programs, only this one was missing over half of its features. I rebuilt it, and again had to creep over to Steve's desk to tell him that, again I was behind because I had to remake the program. Steve was getting a little annoyed. I was getting annoyed. And suspicious. The only other person who works with the inspection software and has access to the programs was Joe. I asked him about the mysterious things that had been happening with them and if he was getting any similar issues. He scoffed and told me, "The program breaking is no excuse. We're falling behind. Go do your job and I'll do mine." I was frustrated. I had a hunch that Joe was the one messing up my programs just to slow me down and set us back even further, but I had no way of telling it was him. Or did I? The inspection software we use is Polyworks, and when you open up a workspace, it tells you when it was first created and when it was last modified. Joe and I work totally different shifts with an hour of overlap so we can communicate on the day's tasks and issues. Oddly enough, the programs that were suffering from freak bugs were modified during this small overlap. Joe was lazy, but he wasn't stupid. If he was trying to sabotage me, he made sure it was at the time our schedules overlapped, so it wasn't obvious that it was him who was causing the issues. I did notice that Joe was using the arm just about every day when I came in, and he was aware of the schedule, so he knew what jobs I would be working on. I knew it was him causing problems, but with Steve getting annoyed with my lack of progress, and Joe continuing to make progress, I didn't have a whole lot of proof, and I wasn't about to go to Steve with what was basically an assumption of Joe messing with me. Instead of wasting my time trying to prove it was Joe, I did some extra work on my lunch breaks to clone every program I had and made a secret master program location on my personal drive. Only I have access to this personal drive, and these master programs could be imported into another program. So if Joe messed up one of my programs, I could simply delete everything and import a copy of the master so I can work with a fully functional program. This worked for weeks. I was starting to get way ahead of Joe again, and he took notice. He was getting visibly angry with me and stood over my shoulder, hovering like a vulture as I opened my damaged programs and replaced them with the secret masters I had. I wanted him to see what I was doing. I wanted him to see that the masters were on my personal drive and he couldn't touch them. I gave him a little crap-eating grin and told him that I was onto him and he could no longer mess with me. Joe seemed to back off at that point, but I wasn't done with him. I was angry that he nearly tarnished the good bond I had with Steve and painted me in a bad light. Steve and I were on good terms again, and everyone still viewed me as a good employee, but I didn't want to take any more crap from Joe. I knew he was still out to get me fired, and I wasn't going to give him the chance. I wanted to get him first. Joe was already starting to face more judgment from Steve, as he was, again, being slow with its progress as compared to mine, but I felt like it needed to go further. I had another sneaking suspicion of Joe as his progress, though still slow, was a lot faster than it was in the past. After I got my one job done, I stayed after work one night to do some snooping around. I went into the jobs folder that Joe was working on and opened the programs up. What I found were half-baked programs that were designed to pass pretty much every part he inspected. I was kind of impressed because making Polyworks pass a failed part is actually tricky to do. What Joe was doing was making programs pass failed parts so he didn't have to go through the work of notifying quality or production on how to improve the quality of the parts. He was passing bad parts and giving good reports to the customers even though their parts were not good at all. Not only is this shady as hell, but it's potentially dangerous. Some of the parts we make go into cars, trucks, military things I can't talk about, and heavy machinery. If we give our customers bad parts, they can potentially lead to problems either during assembly or worse, after the finished product is purchased and used. No one ever questioned Joe's reports or findings because again, no one else knew how the arm worked. I was the only other person who could see how much of a lying jerkface he was. Lying to Steve and other co-workers is one thing, but lying to paying customers, some that trusted us with dozens of jobs, was on so many levels of wrong. Another thing he did was force some features to pass by anchoring them by hand, instead of letting the program extract the measurements from the scan data, which is how these inspections normally work. I spent the next couple of hours running my own versions of the programs and measuring the parts the honest and true way. I printed out my reports and Joe's and plotted my revenge. I scheduled a meeting with Steve, Joe, and Bob the next day. This was last Friday. Steve asked me what this was about, and I said I wanted to review the progress on PPAPs. We were still a little behind, so Steve and Bob were pretty interested in hearing what I had to say. I kicked the meeting off as normal and say what jobs need to be done, what due dates are coming up, and what jobs we need to focus on more. We talk for a bit, and then I see an opportunity to bring up Joe's false reports. I placed the report I ran with my program in front of me, and it was dotted with red blocks, failures on many of the features. Steve was aware of what our Polyworks reports looked like, so he sat up and asked me about it. I just reply, "Ask Joe." Joe looked at the report and his face went white. I then tossed forward Joe's version of the report on the same scanned parts that showed all the features lit up green, saying that they passed inspection. I couldn't help but notice that my programs were failing the same parts you deemed acceptable. You can't cheat the software like this. If you do, it may not seem obvious to anyone else, but I've been using the software for years and I know what a broken program looks like. Don't lie to me or our customers. Joe was silent. You could hear a pin drop in that room. I then brought out the Fireworms laptop to show Steve and Bob a program Joe made. I showed them the hand-anchored features, and once he forced a pass in order to pass the full inspection. Some of the features were out of tolerance by several millimeters, which may not seem like a lot, but in most cases in this company, and most others, even half a millimeter out of tolerance can cause a part to be rejected. Both Steve and Bob now saw that Joe was falsifying reports to the customer. Steve looked like he was ready to explode, and Bob looked at his son totally shocked. Steve thanked me for the information and told me to leave the room and go home for the day. I thanked him and wished him and Joe a wonderful weekend. Needless to say, Joe was fired on the spot. His dad, who normally makes excuses for his behaviour, was furious with him. We are now talking with customers and asking them to review parts we have sent them for any potential issues, and sending some of our inspectors to sort parts if needed. Recalls are still possible for some of the recent jobs Joe did, as these had features that were 3mm out of tolerance, which would cause these particular parts to not assemble correctly. The potential fallout from making and sending customers bad parts could cost the company thousands of dollars. Plus, I'm pretty sure falsifying documents like this could lead to additional punishment for Joe. Even if he doesn't face any kind of legal punishment, I'm sure having this on his record will be a major red flag to any company looking to hire him for a similar position. This guy has also never been to college. Again, his dad just hired him when he graduated high school because he's family. So it will definitely be hard to find a job in this field without a degree. The one main thing Joe has now lost out on was being a potential future owner of a company that is still rapidly growing. I'm not sure how much Bob makes, but whatever it is, Joe is no longer going to have any of that. He could have been a decent employee and worked well with me. Instead, he lost out on a very secure future in his own family's company. Enjoy unemployment, you wad. I'm glad Joe was fired, but now that means I have to balance both my workload and his on my shoulders. Honestly though, it was worth it. I'll take an extra heavy workload and being tired every day over a piece of crap coworker any day. If I hear of any significant updates, I'll post them to this story, but it's already been a few days and I haven't heard much. I'm mainly trying to focus on my work and getting my PPAPs done on time, and my boss and other coworkers are doing damage control for the customers affected. I wonder just how many potentially dangerous parts Joe approved, and hopefully they've caught them all in time before the parts fail and people are put at risk. What he did was insanely stupid and dangerous, and all for the sake of being petty because someone can do their job more efficiently than you. I'm glad he's lost everything. Maybe he'll learn something. Okay, so that's all for r/ProRevenge. I really hope you did enjoy it. As always, if you do want to see more content like this, then please do subscribe. My Twitter, Discord, and Patreon links are in the description, and any support is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!